I'm Georgina Rose, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. I'm your host, Georgina Rose, or Darling, and I am a part-time esoteric content creator and part-time surfer of the Enochian Aethers. And in this video, I'm going to be continuing my Planetary Magick series that I've been running for a while, where I go through the 7 classical, though it might extend to all of the planets, and talk about the esoteric mysteries associated with them, the religious traditions associated with them, and kind of how to work with them from a metaphysical perspective. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about one of the most discussed planets, Venus. Now, the thing about Venus, though, is Venus is a lot more complicated than people make Venus out to be. Many people describe Venus as the planet of love, beauty, and that's basically it. And of course, those are key epithets of Venus, and they will be discussed a lot in this video, but Venus actually has a lot more going on, and it's very interesting. To reduce Venus down to just romantic love is a misconception. Venus is really, really complicated, and there's a lot of mystical ways to engage with Venus besides like just manifesting a partner. So without further ado, let's get into the subject. To begin, I think it is good to discuss the two astrological signs associated with Venus, because whenever we look at the signs that are ruled by a planet, we get a lot of insight into what that planet represents. And that would be Taurus and Libra. Taurus is the sign of the bull. Taurus is known for being very into luxurious things, beauty, all those typical Venus associations. And Taurus is an earth sign, meaning that Venus is associated with earth. However, when we look over at Libra, or the balanced scales, the sign of harmony and equilibrium, which is actually an air planet, we see that Venus is now associated with both air and earth, which is really interesting because typically the planets have a singular elemental correspondence. Earth obviously represents being grounded in the material world, linked back to reality, and air is pretty much the opposite of that, right? Air is the intellectual world, the mind, which are things people don't immediately associate with Venus, but are heavily associated with Venus when you get into it. As well, there is a slight water associated with Venus because of the myth of Venus coming out of the sea foam, which I will also discuss a bit later. So we see immediately that Venus kind of floats between these different elemental natures. And actually, Venus has a lot to do with the idea of harmony. And that I'll discuss too. So let's begin with the start of the Venusian mysteries, which I'm going to talk about as love. So love is an incredible thing that humans experience, and it is one of the most metaphysical experiences that we go through in our entire lives. And when we look at love, in English, I kind of hate the word love, right? Love refers to so many different things, but you know, we use one word for it, right? Like we say, I love you to our pets, we say, I love you to our family members, and we say, I love you to our partners. But those are all kind of different loves. Like they are love, they all come from that same place in our heart, but they're not quite the same. And so I think it's really valuable to look at the wisdom of the ancient Greeks and consider how they broke love into several sub-definitions. They had terms for love for the divine, love for the self, love for the romantic partner, love for the family member, love for the community and friends, and a lot of other words. And all of those are parts of love and are experienced differently, and thus the metaphysical mysteries of all of them are quite different. I'd like to zoom in onto eros, or romantic love, for this bit of the video. Eros is the love we are most familiar with. And the myth of Eros, or Cupid in the Greek equivalency, is basically that there is a deity named Eros who is the son of Venus, who is able to take these arrows and shoot them into the heart of the lover. When the arrow penetrates the heart of the lover, they are wounded, they bleed, they suffer. And until they are able to unite with their soulmate, their second half, they are in pain. And then when they meet that person, they slip into a state known as theomania, or divine madness, or lovesickness. And basically, they fall into this very intense state of desire and connection, and detached from the rational faculty. And then, as that love progresses, the unification of the opposites happens, and there is a merging of two, right? Because what is love's final result? It is the merging of two individuals into something greater than themselves. And when we look at metaphysical mysteries such as the Tree of Life, we see these triads, right? There is the masculine, the feminine, and then when they unite, you get equilibrium, or the magical child, and the two are actually destroyed to create something greater. And so love and death are linked, because when you fall in love and when you experience that divine madness, you actually destroy yourself entirely and become a new being, a union. In Christianity, they use the term the creation of one flesh. I really like that term, even though I'm not a Christian. I think that explains that very, very well. And in many esoteric systems, the experience of Eros is a way towards divine annihilation or the unity with the Godhead, which is the end goal of most mystic traditions. Because when you experience Eros, you are experiencing a form of annihilation that can then sort of lead you towards that divine annihilation that you experience later on in your mystic path. And thus, Venus is vital in those higher level of mysteries. And when we actually look at Venus's Greek equivalent, Aphrodite, we see something really interesting, because within mythology, we have these terms called epithets, or basically like variants on a name of a goddess that refer to different functions of that goddess. And Aphrodite is broken up into a lot of different things, right? There's a lot of Aphrodite X, Aphrodite Y. And of course, there are those for eros and romantic love. But one that's really interesting is Aphrodite Urania, which is like this very high kind of celestial form of Aphrodite that is more about like love as a sense of like divine unity and divine growth, right? It's this very like high tier abstract, kind of like as you start getting towards Keter on the Kabbalistic tree of life, right? It's like the dissolution of forms towards something higher. Which is just fascinating, because Venus is like a conduit to the highest levels of mysteries, even through her simplest form, which is of course Eros. Now, when we also talk about the nature of the soul, we need to discuss Venus a bit, because one part of the Eros myth is this being named Psyche, or we know the term Psyche is like your psychology. Basically, there is a human woman named Psyche who developed a relationship with Eros. She was the lover of Eros, meaning that she is the ultimate lover because she is the lover of love personified. And essentially what happened is she loved so much that she ceased to be a human and became a goddess in her own right, the goddess of the mind, the goddess of the psyche. That's where we get the word psyche. And so it shows this transmutative quality of Venus as a way to even break beyond personhood and towards even ideas like apotheosis. Now, apotheosis I don't talk a lot about because most religions do argue for theosis, or unity with the Godhead through dissolution, but the idea of sort of becoming beyond the human form, or apotheosis, is a Venusian type of concept if you really look at that, which is wild because people do not associate that with that, but it shows the metaphysical power of love. Because if we look at a lot of Western mystical traditions, specifically traditions like Thelema, what is the highest magical secret? What is the highest ritualistic secret of those mysteries? It is actually the Venusian union. That is what that is about, right? A lot of those traditions really do lead there. And within the Christian tradition, and we look at the idea of vocations as a key idea within Christianity, which is basically that every soul has like a thing they're destined to do. Marriage is considered as valuable a vocation as becoming a priest, right? It's very valuable, and most religions recognize the divine potential of Venusian mysteries. Now, the other thing that Venus is heavily associated with, and this is very important, is the entire notion of the divine feminine. So Venus is the epitome of the divine feminine, right? She is solidly on the feminine pillar on the tree of life. And when we look at the feminine, what is feminine? Femininity is form. The masculine represents force, the feminine represents form, creation, formation. So we understand masculine generates, feminine contracts and forms. Masculine is endless expansion, feminine is endless contraction, which is quite interesting because when we look at the rulership of planets, often it is said that things that are malefic or destructive would inherently be feminine because femininity is that form. But Venus is kind of an outlier. Venus is actually considered a benefic or a generative planet, despite being a form-based metaphysical concept, because Venus is so solid within the feminine mysteries, which is just really interesting because Venus is creating through formation, right? Instead of just destroying with formation, Venus is forming into something new, which is just a very interesting like twist on a lot of Western metaphysical concepts. Venus is really an outlier in so many ways, and it's just so fascinating to see it all play out. Now, the next thing about Venus that's really interesting is the interplay of Venus and Mars. So Venus, of course, rules beauty, love, but Venus also has a war epithet. And this isn't brought up a lot with like the modern portrayal of Venus, but if we look at the goddesses that formed Venus, you see a lot of war goddesses on that list. And we look at Mars, Mars also has so much to do with love. And so I think an interesting way to see it is like Venus is that feminine version of love and Mars is that masculine version of love, but they cannot exist without each other, and they actually rule over a lot of the same things. Venus and Mars are kind of, there's a cool dance and interplay between them metaphysically. And you actually, for rituals, you would go to Mars for and Venus for, you can actually do things even similar. One thing that is pretty solidly just associated with Mars is athleticism, but even with athleticism, the perfection of the human form through like becoming as beautiful as possible and in the best shape as possible, that will be Venusian. And so even with like ideas like athleticism that we see as solidly martial, there is still that Venusian like equivalency. And so it's really interesting when I see people who have spiritual practices that incorporate both Mars and Venus. You can do some really interesting invocations where you invoke them together, or you have like two ritual participants and one is invoking Mars, one is invoking Venus. You can do some super fascinating stuff with all of that and create some really interesting ritualatic formulas. And it's cool stuff that you can do with Venus and Mars. And the way they interplay is just, it's fascinating to me and really, really cool. Now, when we look at Venus's evolution, this gets really interesting because it shows why Venus is not really mentioned in the Abrahamic tradition. Of course, love and specifically marriage are parts of Abrahamic mysteries, but actual Venus stuff, less so. And this also does show a bit of the metaphysical and paradigm-based divides between Judaism, Christianity, and then over in Islam. But basically, let's get into it because this is wild. So we understand that the Jewish religion originated from Canaanite paganism, right? The Canaanites had their own religion, and that was that region, Israel, Palestine, you know? Call it what you want. Fight in the comments. Fight in the comments on what you want to call canon. It's a really great activity, really fun. Everyone's gonna get along with that one. Good times. Anyways, canon. I'm just gonna call it canon, okay? So ancient Canaan was a pagan land. They had a form of Canaanite paganism. All the Near Eastern paganisms at this point in history were pretty similar. Like you'll see certain god names appearing in South Arabian, North Arabian, Phoenician, Canaan, like all these things overlapped quite a bit just because of the way like tribal interplay and merchants and wars were going on at that time. But when we're talking about Canaan, where Judaism came from, we understand that the tribe that would later become the Jewish people kind of had their own little zone in the desert, and the rest of the Canaanites were kind of on their own. And the Canaanites generally had a like duotheistic pantheon. Of course, they had a lot of gods, but there were two like main gods, two popular gods, two gods with the most clout, and that would be Baal, the storm god, and Astarte, the goddess of love, sex, and war. These are the two big gods. Makes sense, right? They were an agricultural society and everyone needs love and war, right? Good times. So those are the two main gods. Now, the god that would later become the Jewish god, or Yahweh, was actually a different god. It was a war and storm god similar to Baal, but really was only worshipped by this small, like, desert tribe, like, pretty irrelevant on the grand scheme. And there was some beefing between this desert tribe and the main Canaanite people. And then, of course, like, the Jewish people declared themselves to be monotheistic in this very strange way. If you look at the commandments in the early parts of the Torah and Bible, you see that the commandment is not there is only one God, as it is in the Islamic Shahada, as that is there is no God but Allah. That is the Islamic confession of faith. Whereas in the Ten Commandments, it never denies the existence of multiple gods. It says, you may put no God before me. Now, of course, as Abrahamic theology, like, became more and more clear, especially as you get into Christianity with like Aquinas and whatnot, like it becomes very solidly monotheistic. But this early form of Judaism, this early form of the Abrahamic religions can best be described as henotheism, or the belief that there are multiple gods, but the choice to only worship one for reasons of either seeing that God as the most powerful or just the one you worship. Interestingly, a lot of pagans could arguably be called henotheists in certain ways, specifically ones that worship only one God. Like the people who are big like Odin guys, kind of henotheists in certain ways. It's interesting stuff, but basically, yeah, like it was a henotheistic thing going on, and they really hated the cult of Astarte. That was that love and war cult, the feminine cult, right? Astarte was the most demonized out of these two. Now, of course, Baal is discussed in these early writings, but just kind of as vaguely evil. Like there were specific prohibitions against Astarte. Now, there are some interesting, somewhat heretical and heterodox perspectives saying that there is a sort of early time equivalent where they picked up this goddess Asherah and made her the wife of Yahweh. Now that is somewhat historically disputed, but there are definitely people who make that argument. But regardless of whether you see Asherah as the wife of God in these early Jewish writings, or you think she doesn't exist, she was taken out, right? She was removed and it became you can only worship Yahweh. And then as Judaism became more and more monotheistic, Yahweh became a forbidden term to say. Even the word God is not like said by a lot of Orthodox Jewish people. You see them write it G-D, right, to like protect the name. You can argue 8 million reasons why that happened, but that happened. And anyways, basically, Astarte, super, super demonized. And what was Astarte associated with? The morning and evening star in the sky. And this is going to carry as Astarte becomes Inanna Ishtar, And Inanna Ishtar was that infamous goddess of Mesopotamia, Samaria, and she was love, sex, war, and a lot of like sexual mysteries and all that comes from Inanna Ishtar. Inanna Ishtar is very, very aggressive, very intense. Venus is much more pacified than the idea of Inanna Ishtar. She's this very dark, heavy, intense feminine energy. Very, very martial. I mean, she's honestly like almost a full-on martial femininity, but she retains as it becomes, and there is the crossing of the Mediterranean Sea, that is retained in Aphrodite. And we see this image of Aphrodite coming out of the seashell on the other side of the Mediterranean Ocean and then walking into the European continent. That was literal. This goddess, Venus, came from the Middle East into Europe. She literally crossed the Mediterranean and came onto European shores. And then, of course, Aphrodite becomes Venus as the Romans rise to power. But even with like Venus associations, we see in the sky, and this is so interesting because the term Venus wasn't even being used. That morning and evening star that people were seeing when they woke up and went to bed is the planet Venus, which is one of the coolest synchronicities ever. But this idea of the morning and evening star being Venus holds. Now, when we move out of Judaism and into Christianity, the term morning star is often used in a interesting way. I mean, further Christian writers would argue the morning star is Lucifer. Now, this is not really in the Bible. This is like a Christian extrapolation because the Christians added a lot once you start getting into church fathers' writings and saint visions and all of this. But yes, there are some claims of this. I think this is a continuation of the early Judaic problems with Astarte because they saw Astarte and Baal's cult as competitive and something that would pull people away from monotheism. And so I believe this is a demonization of the divine feminine, this attribution. Now, does that mean like Venus as a whole is satanic or something? Obviously not. Satan, Morningstar, all these things are not actually like combined until much later in Christianity and kind of brought into one core concept. So don't think like Venus is evil. Venus is not. Venus is holy. This is just kind of like a monotheistic, polytheistic divide and argument and dispute. Now, when we look further into the Venusian mysteries, we see, obviously I've talked about Eros. I think it is also worth talking about other forms of love that we experience, specifically self-love. So Venus is obviously associated with beauty. She is the goddess of beauty. She's the goddess of the feminine form. And when you look at like ancient paintings and sculptures of Venus, that would be how the ancients viewed the ideal female form to be. And that's really interesting because the artistic depictions of Venus are very consistent in how she looks. Now, when we look at modern beauty standards, Venus does not represent modern beauty standards, okay? If you have body image problems or something like that, I mean, I know so many women do, right? Venus does not like hate you. Venus does not rule over the ever-changing beauty standards. Venus is a beauty that is eternal. And when we talk about beauty as a concept, I think people really get distracted. They're like, oh, the beauty industry. Oh, the ways that we have to do all these procedures, right? No. I'm talking about divine beauty. And divine beauty is real. Divine beauty is not like kind of subjective and ever-changing like modern ideas of beauty are, right? Divine beauty is truth. And that is why Venus is also associated with justice and harmony, because beauty and truth go together. And so many people also think like beauty is vain, right? Oh, I'm all intellectual. I'm better than beauty. Like, are you going to say like you stared at like a beautiful waterfall and like, oh, that's vain, right? Venus rules over all beauty, not just like women being pretty. Venus rules over natural beauty, artistic beauty, all of these things, the entire notion of beauty. And beauty is a virtue. Beauty is a good thing. Beauty is not bad. Now, would I say like modern beauty industry stuff is bad? Yeah, it's super predatory and fucked up. But beauty itself is not that. And I hate that people like really lump those things together. I think that's very toxic and sad. And if you have those problems, like if that like really hurts you and upsets you, like working with Venus is great because Venus is a healer, right? Healing means a lot of different things, right? Healing isn't just medicinal healing. And so if you are struggling with self-love, insecurities, self-hatred, body dysmorphia, all of these things, Venusian mysteries are really good. Like I know a lot of women who have really struggled with their self-image, who have connected with Venus and developed a worship relationship to Venus, and it's really helped them work through those problems. And if you have any sort of self-hate, I mean, not just even like appearance-based, like just in general, the ability to love yourself and have confidence is a Venusian thing. And so if you do struggle in that regard, like Venus can be great. I think Venus for mental health reasons is one of the most healing planetary mysteries out there. And I really recommend developing that. If you become a Venus devotee and you go through those like mysteries of Eros and whatnot, also remembering the mysteries of self-love. And also like in general, like there are all these like rituals out there about trying to become more beautiful. Those are obviously Venusian mysteries, like Venusian Pentacles of Solomon, glamours, all those things can really help you with that. But you can't do that without self-love. And Venus is discerning, right? Venus is also a goddess of judgment and harmony. And so if you are struggling with, say, narcissism or prioritizing your beauty over your health or something, Venus would not represent that and would not have to do with any of that. That is unfortunately a spiritual disease of the heart or something to be worked through in shadow work. And I really wanted to add that there. As well, if you are someone who has been harmed by painful, toxic romantic relationships. I know that's unfortunately very, very common. Or even if you're dealing with a heartbreak from a normal relationship, healing those wounds and those mental pains would be a Venusian mystery and would be ruled by the planet of Venus. So if that is also something you're struggling with, if you're struggling in general, Venus is a healer too. It is not just falling in love. People think of Venusian mysteries as I'm going to manifest the perfect partner. And of course that can be done, but that's not the whole of it. And that's really what I wanted to drive home. The Venusian mysteries are really complicated. And just in general, if you want a gateway into divine feminine work and understanding the divine feminine, Venus rules all of that. So she's really a multifaceted planetary thing. In terms of beginning ritual, the Orphic hymn to Venus is really lovely. Also, since there are all those different variants of Aphrodite, you can get really specific with your prayers and look up prayers to the specific epithets and go with those. The ruling day of Venus is Friday. The Venus hours happen a few times a day. You can look up a planetary hour calculator and see those. So pick a Venus day, pick a Venus hour, say that Orphic hymn. Seashells are very sacred, so if you want to represent her on your home altar, get a little seashell, a real one, not a fake one, and you can represent her. I also think it's very powerful, and I've done this in the past. I don't live by the ocean, but when I've been to the beach, doing her rituals by the beach can be very powerful because that is, of course, a place she rules. So, all those kind of aquatic and marine mystical traditions heavily overlap with Venus. And just in general, there's a lot of ways. Venus also moves very quickly in the sky. And so Venus moves through the signs quite quickly. So you're going to be having Venus transits pretty often. And so if you are someone who does transit-based spiritual practice, you look at what's going on in the sky and then you do rituals based on that, you do specific rituals for your Venus return, which is when Venus comes back to the sign Venus was in when you were born. Venus moves so quickly that there's a lot of opportunity for that. To kind of get all that work done. So there's many ways to interface with Venus, and all of those mysteries I was discussing can be explored in a Venusian spiritual practice. So that's all I have to say for this video. If you want to come on a trip with me to Greece, you can book that in the description below. I sell tarot readings. You can book one of those below. I host the podcast, The Postmodern Iconoclast, which is on this YouTube channel and on Spotify under The Postmodern Iconoclast. I've been your host, Dot Darling. I have a Patreon where you get a bonus video every month, ritual guides every month, and if you're a high enough tier, I do a mentorship service where I can help you through your spiritual life. And I'm considering opening astrology readings. I might have those open by the time this video goes up. Maybe. If not, that's a little tease of something to come. I'm under Dot Darling, D-A-T Darling on Instagram, TikTok, Telegram, Substack. I actually wrote a Substack article recently that kind of relates to this video, so that might be worth checking out. Twitter, Instagram, I don't know if I said that. I'm everywhere. You can find me all over the internet. I post all the places. And have an amazing day, night, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Please like, comment, subscribe, and if you ring the bell for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel and you'll never need to watch another video again. All right, bye!